Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second episode of Emancipatory Education Now. It's a student-led initiative here at San Jose Lurie College of Education that examines what emancipatory education, the critical evaluation that um, examines the systems and structures of oppression that maintain the status quo in our educational institutions, what they look like in today's society, and we advocate for the expansion of emancipatory education research, policies, and practices. In today's episode, we'll be focusing on ethnic studies and the benefits that it can have for students, especially students of color. So my name is Gabi. I use my pronouns are she, hers, and here are the rest of my co-hosts.
Oh. Hi, I'm Leslye. My pronouns are she, her.
Hi, I'm Jackie, she, hers.
Hi, I'm Vinson, they, them.
And I'm Annie, she, her.
Great. So we'll first start off with a short video, and it's a spoken word. I love spoken words. I think they really get at some of the heart and the soul of things that we try to make more academic. And I love this because it talks about just the benefits that ethnic studies can have and how personal talking about it can be. So let me share my screen for you all, and we'll get started with that. Share. Can you guys hear the sound?
In college, I used to sit in the back of the class with the other students of color and listen as my white peers theorized the hell out of the oppression that we were born from. Buzzwords like institutionalized racism and class warfare with sugar on their tongues, sweet and comfortable. Words from a language my community didn't even know existed because we were too busy living the realities of them. You see, it's one thing to major in ethnic studies, it is another thing to be the reason for its existence. For the white students in my major, ethnic studies was like a free study abroad program that didn't require that they bring their baggage with them. A privilege that is easy for them to close in their textbook at the end of class. You see, my life is beginning to feel a lot like a free ethnic studies lecture with no tenure. Is this what they meant by public education? But study my racial profile till it exhausts you. Study how black has been made to feel like a green light for stop and frisk. How brown has been made to feel like a much needed check stop at any given border. Ask me what it's like to have my skin be made to feel like a nuclear missile we all know is coming. And you still won't know what it's like to sit in the back of a class and be studied because of how tragic your history is. As if we've only been brought in to be dissected. As if frogs, rats, and people of color can only be understood when you cut them open. See, when ethnic studies, it is not school anymore. It is a lesson in survival. And I'm so tired of playing teacher with my oppression. If I'm not doing it on a stage, I'm doing it from the margins of a classroom. I'm doing it from the margins in my notebook. Always on the margins of something, never the core. Never asked to be anything more than what makes it easy to feel sorry for. You see, it's easy to avoid confronting the things that make us feel uncomfortable. The things that make us feel guilty. Who chooses to walk through the war zone if you are told that you don't have to? If you grew up believing that there isn't one? If what you don't know won't kill you? Race is the rent I pay for this skin. So the belief that racism doesn't exist anymore, especially in my own major, is when I feel the foreclosure of this home taking my knees from right under me. You can't claim that racism doesn't exist if you've never known what it means to survive it. If you keep looking at the war zone like a comfort zone that you're not ready to sacrifice, it's easy to avoid confronting the things that make us feel uncomfortable, the things that make us feel guilty. But comfort is what kills us in the long run. Comfort is sitting down when you should be on your feet. Comfort is staying quiet when you should be speaking up. Comfort is speaking too much when you should be listening. Comfort is building borders for safety and not bridges for healing. Comfort is celebrating diversity but never discussing it. As if a black president is enough. As if a heritage month is enough. As if ethnic studies is enough. As if this poem is fucking enough. Comfort is sitting in the front of a class, forgetting that we're all sitting right behind you, wanting to tell you that the war zone still exists, wanting to tell you that this isn't comfortable for any of us.
I love that. I thought her voice was so powerful in the way that she just expressed herself. What were your all initial thoughts? Maybe we can just do a go around. And we can start with you because you're first on my screen.
Okay. Wow. Like, I loved that. And that was just So powerful. And I think that I've actually watched a bunch of spoken word poetry. I'm a huge fan of it, and I've never come across that one. And now I just want to hear more of that artist's work. And I know that I definitely took something away from that personally, which just makes me want to hear more. And I think that that's such a powerful medium for voices. Thank you so much for sharing that, Gabi.
Jackie, maybe you can go next. It's hard because it's like I'm pointing at you, but you can't see where I'm pointing.
Yeah, like what Annie said, thank you, Gabi, for choosing that spoken word. And just really, it's a very powerful outlet. And there's just like different phrases that stuck out to me. One being where they mentioned bridges to healing. And I think that's my main takeaway from everything that they were saying.
Maybe Vinson?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for sharing that awesome video, Gabi. It was pretty powerful to watch that spoken piece. It was really well delivered, and really like I was paying attention to a lot of like the phrases that were like being repeated over the course, and I was like, wow, it's like really emphasizing over that point, and it's really making like a strong statement. And one thing that really stood out for me was definitely the phrase like, oh, it's comfortable to be quiet. And I think like that's really what needs to be addressed more, because a lot of folks can be speaking up and supporting different oppressed groups, but they're not speaking up. Everyone's just comfortable being quiet, so there's no change being made. So definitely that point stood out to me. Thank you for sharing the video.
Thank you for those thoughts. Leslye?
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone said already. I think one of the pieces that stood out to me was the idea that people who are from marginalized communities and backgrounds, that we somehow are comfortable in our oppression or uncomfortable speaking out against it, right? And I think that there's a shared experience there in terms of the danger that is involved in challenging the status quo, which I think fueled some of her passion in that piece, right? Some people could easily come away with it like, wow, why is she, raising her voice, or why does she seem so upset? And it's like, no, this is the fire that fuels us to keep going every day. This is the ancestry that has so long been taunted and toiled for us to potentially speak up and be free, right? And so I was just truly inspired by it. And I also liked the piece where she, hinted at how we treat ethnic studies as electives to a white curriculum, right? So it's an option for you to learn about people of color. It's a requirement to do all this other stuff in our curriculum. And so really pushing against that, I think, is a critical piece for us to keep in the forefront.
Oh, I love what all of you had to say about that. I think you guys are all getting at the point that ethnic studies is really personal. It's just not an alternate view of history. It's an alternate view of viewing yourself. And I think that's why a lot of people can find empowerment through it. I have a friend that works as an ethnic studies high school teacher in San Francisco Unified, and they got at what all of you guys are saying. They said that it's not just history, it's a lot of psychology, anthropology, sociology, family history, your own personal experience, going through your values. And it's a very personal process to be able to learn about your own history and the history of others. And that's why I love this. And also, Jackie, what you were saying about healing, that it's a way for healing, because when I was talking to the teacher, they said that for students have to be prepared to dig deep. They can't just skim the surface and write something about World War II. They're digging deep into their own psyches and their own, like, who they are. So I love that. So first, I'll just give you guys all a brief little history. It's a very brief history, just a recap of ethnic studies. As you all know, ethnic studies has become I'm sure you guys have all heard of the San Francisco state strike that happened in 1969, and that was the first time, that was through the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State, and they were able to get the first college level ethnic studies class over there, and that kind of ignited a whole broad, like breadth of programs to be extended to other college level programs. And more recently, there's been talk about ethnic studies in high school classrooms and in elementary school classrooms. More locally, Alum Rock School District, which serves K through 8, was able to get ethnic studies passed in their school district, as well as Oak Grove District, which is also in the San Jose area. And then also something exciting for us as CSU students was the bill that requires all 23 CSU campuses, in order to graduate from the undergrad, you have to take an ethnic studies class. And currently on the bill is on the agenda is to get all high school students in California to take a semester of ethnic studies to graduate. And that was struck down by Jerry Brown back in 2018, but it's Governor Newsom brought it up again, and it's something that is being in revision and being amended. So hopefully that can be in place by 2023, 2024. So we'll jump into the study. We all read a little bit of a study by the Stanford Graduate School of Education, and it looked at ethnic studies in the San Francisco the San Francisco high schools, about 19 of them, and it compared outcomes for students who enrolled in these classes and students who did not. And it found that students who took ethnic studies in 9th grade had an improved GPA in math, science courses, attendance, number of courses that they were able to take, so increasing their credits. And I like the study because I think it got at the big impact that ethnic studies can have on a student. So first, I guess my first question for you all was, what was your first experience taking an ethnic studies class or learning an alternate view of history, and how did it impact you?
Can I just speak first as an SF State alum? I just want to make one clarification. The 1968 student strike was actually orchestrated by the Black Student Union on campus. The Third World Liberation Front came as an allyship group, but it is often that the BSU is not given the credit for that particular student strike. And I would just like to acknowledge and honor the role that the Black Student Union played in ensuring that we have ethnic studies. So that's a key piece to keep in mind. So I took my first ethnic studies course at the home of ethnic studies, San Francisco State University. And it was indeed eye-opening on multiple levels. One was having my first Black female college professor teach the course, but it was also just an opportunity for me to learn so much about different races and ethnicities than I had ever really been exposed to before. And the class really also challenged all of what we had been taught in our, mainly in our high school US history, because I think that was a key piece. And as a student who came through the advanced placement US history course, just seeing how inaccurate our textbooks and readings were related to who's contributed to not only this country, but who's contributed to growth and development around the world. And so and I think I've mentioned this text before, but I feel like I'm having deja vu tonight. One of our books was Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen. And I thought that was a great introductory piece. And from that class, I ended up taking many other classes, right? So classes in Black Studies department, classes in Asian American Studies, because I was just really interested in learning more. And one of the things that I still hold from that class is the degree of environmental racism that exists, which we see domestically here when it comes to things like not responding appropriately to hurricane relief in communities that are ravaged when they are poor and predominantly Black communities. We saw with Flint, Michigan, people asking them not to impact the water source. And now we're 5 years later and still don't have clean water. We've seen this with the multiple times that Indigenous treaties have been overrun or violated by our U.S. government, and the pipelines and even things that are happening in Hawaii related to satellites being placed in certain Indigenous locations. And but in that class, I had first heard that term. I had never heard environmental racism before, and learning about how we were as a country dumping our electric waste in water sources in other countries, right? And thinking that as the US, it's okay to do that because we're the powerful group, or we're the group that other people can depend upon. So I think ethnic studies certainly just helped me to be less isolated in my thinking about what role we play as people, but also in being willing to have a critical eye about even where we live, right? I think a lot of our earlier education focuses a lot on patriotism and a desire for us to really kind of worship the United States. And in going to college and learning about all the atrocities that we've also been involved in as a country really gave me a different perspective. And I think that that's something that I've held on to.
I love what you said, Leslye. I think what you said just reminds me of how we learn in the class that there are words to experiences that people are experiencing, and maybe experiences that you've experienced as well. Like environmental racism, you observe it. Like you observe it when you're like, some people are closer to highways or some people are closer to factories. And it's really eye-opening. Who else has something that's calling to them that they would like to say about their experience taking ethnic studies?
I can jump in. And one thing, Leslye, that you mentioned was your first ethnic studies class in college was also your first Black female professor. And I had the same experience. My first ethnic studies course at UC Berkeley was not only my first female Black professor, but my first and only Black professor while I was there, which I think says a lot. And it was, again, very eye-opening. And like, I think, I love what you said too, Gabi, that ethnic studies is not alternative history. I think it is just history. And in fact, the history that we learn in schools is alternative history. And just the amount that has been cut out and the story that has been fabricated and strung together and all of the facts and perspectives that have been left out. My first ethnic studies class was my first exposure to so much of that. And I think that's really sad and also just very responsible for a lot of the, ignorant, just not knowing and not understanding that we see going on right now. It happens all the time.
What about you, Vinson? Have you had a chance to take ethnic studies, or what was your first experience like learning a different view of history than the one you had been taught?
So definitely, I've never taken ethnic studies yet, but I'm planning to take ethnic studies hopefully next semester. I'm really excited about that. But I remember particularly, I had teachers who were really passionate about teaching students like a different perspective. And one of them was definitely my US history teacher during my junior year of high school. She was also Black, and she was very passionate about teaching US history in a way that brought light to, what the Blacks in the country were facing. And she taught it in a very honest and very powerful way, where I definitely saw that like no teachers like taught it that way before. Like she told us different stories about like perspective pieces from that's not from mainstream media. Like sometimes you see a textbook and that's what they give you, but there are other different like pieces that are more personal, such as like Frederick Douglass's work, or so many of these other like, you know, firsthand narratives that tell the real picture and the real story. So I thought that was really insightful. But I also remember an experience where I went to like this leadership conference where we talked about privilege and oppression, and we were just like looking at images where it's like flipped in society. So like say for example, you typically associate certain stereotypes with a certain career, and then what if that picture was flipped? So like a good example of this would be like nail salons, and you typically imagine, you know, Asian women working, and then white women like sitting on the nail salon chairs. And then what if it was flipped that way? And then there was another powerful picture I saw of like dolls, like, you know, a Black girl looking at a whole row of dolls and just seeing all white dolls. But then like, what if that was flipped? And that was just really interesting, because it's like I was thinking about different narratives that should be represented. And that's why I hope to take ethnic studies, just to be able to understand more about different narratives and my own narrative, which I don't really see in US history either.
I love that. I love that your high school teacher was able to give that to you, because I think a lot of us don't get an accurate like depiction of history in K through 12. And also just having an educator of color, specifically a Black woman, that was able to give you a more comprehensive view.
Yeah, just real quick before I share, Vinson, you're going to love it. It's really eye-opening, you know, just things that aren't talked about, or just common knowledge. My first experience with ethnic studies was one of my first classes at San Jose State. And it was when Chicano study department was Mexican American studies. And I just remember the professors just their topics that they made like part of their classes, and just kind of the way it tied in and like its relevancy. I remember one time we took a trip to one of the missions with like in the San Jose area. I think it's like closer to Gilroy. I'm not sure. Not the
Bautista or no?
Yeah. And then, but we talked about it from like a historical context, you know, and it was just like, it was very eye-opening, and just like, wow, like, why didn't I learn about this when I was younger? Like, why am I only learning about this as I'm in college, you know, like, why am I only getting access to this information in college, you know, like, why is, you know, so just like all these different things. But it's, my mind always just goes back to like, it's never too early to talk about these things. And really just hearing this conversation about how Vinson, like you had your experience in high school, you know, like that's really awesome. It's empowering, and really just makes me passionate about what I'm pursuing in my own career.
I visited the mission in 3rd grade, the
Yeah.
Juan Bautista, and it was definitely portrayed as a good thing. Like the Spaniards were so nice, and oh yeah, my mom told me, she was like, because she's Latina, and she was like, I hate the Spaniards, I hate the Spanish. So I was like, something's off here. Like they're telling me it's right, but I just still kind of was like, oh well, it was fun. I got ice cream that day, but I don't know. I'm just like, that's crazy. But that's so cool that you were able to go back as like an adult, or not go back, but go there as an adult and learn the comprehensive history of it.
Yeah.
My first experience taking an ethnic studies class was at De Anza Community College, and I had it was race and ethnicity, and I had an Asian American professor, and we learned about the histories of just all different ethnic groups in the United States over time. And for me, it was really eye-opening, because it helped me understand just like the more the historical context. Like I think talking about what it means to be colonized versus being an immigrant. And I just think it really helped break down things that like I kind of knew to be wrong. Like, okay, it's not because people are lazy or because anything like that, but just learning about the history really helped contextualize things for me, and helped me be able to, if I ever have to fight anyone, now I know what to say. So I guess the next question that I was just curious from you all was, in this article, and I think just from other classes we've taken for ourselves, we've seen that ethnic studies has a large impact, not just on academic outcomes, but on your social outcomes and your emotional outcomes. And why do you think ethnic studies has that big of an impact on students?
I mean, it's an opportunity for many students to see themselves in the classroom. And Leslye, we can't hear you. You can hear me now? No? Yes? I think I was talking a minute ago and Gabi kept talking, so I just moved on to the next thing. It's all good. Okay, so I'm so embarrassed. So I think, there's something really critical about education and being able to see yourself in the curriculum. And, if we look at progress and achievement from the perspective of how our educational systems have been intended to serve white students, then we can certainly see how they might progress in relationship to that. When more examples are given that are meaningful to you because that's something you can actually relate to from the teacher's example. And several of us have mentioned just the identities of our teachers or faculty members and how that impacted what we got, right? And what we know nationally is that there still is not a great representation of diversity among at least university level faculty across the country, right? San Jose State included. And so in thinking about that, not only being able to see yourself in what you're learning, but also to see a teacher, an authority figure per se, in front of you that is also representative of what you're more familiar with. I think these things have all to do with helping us to grow and develop as people. And when that's been denied, right? When it's been intentionally not included, we can't discount the harm then that has occurred. So I think it's forming psychologically in terms of helping people to see themselves and helping them to develop a self-identity that is not one of assimilation and just figuring out how to fit within, but one that actually allows people and encourages students to live out loud. And I think a lot of that happens in college, but it could certainly happen much earlier developmentally if we actually trusted children and engaged them in what are the things that they're interested in. And I think a little bit of the article spoke to this. It's like, how do we bring in stuff that is relevant to students so that they actually stay? If the goal of learning is to keep people in learning, then we would do more of the stuff that keeps students engaged and less of the stuff that's interested in kicking them out. And so that's just my 2 cents. I don't know what I was trying to say earlier when I was on mute. So that's that.
If you're ever talking for more than 5 seconds and you feel like people are talking over you, probably can't hear you because I would let you talk.
Yeah, Leslye, I really love the way you just tied all of that. It's like, it's relevant, and it's like building their self-identity, and just when you see someone that looks like you, representation has power, and that's really, it strengthens like your commitment to learning about all of that. I don't know. And then, sorry, I know we already talked about ethnic studies and if I took one, but there's another class I took that was called Changing the Majority. And I just remember we talked about like all sorts of minority groups in the US that I was not aware about. And then just like, there was a lot of like Indian immigrants that ended up in Mexico. So there's a lot of like the Indian culture there, and I was like, what? I didn't know about this. Or also kind of going back, or like to Thanksgiving, like why don't we really learn about Thanksgiving, what it really was, until like we're older? And it's just yeah, like just the power of being able to have that influence on the way that students create and develop their own self-identity, and just really giving them that space and that environment and just that support to be able to do so. And tying that back into like, it's never too early to start doing that. Like when I was in the role of being a lead toddler teacher, I realized, you know, I'm in the Midwest, you know, it's majority white people, just like not a lot of other cultures around. So I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna start reading diversity books because this is my classroom and that's what I want to do. And then I would even tie that into like the conversations we have during lunch, like, oh look, like my hair looks different than their hair, like, oh look, like their eye color is different than mine. And it's really just like, yeah, like we're all different, but we're all here, you know? And I thought that was pretty sweet, just like these two little 3-year-olds just like all talking to each other, like, hey, we're different. But it's like, it was so cute, yeah.
No, I like what you keep emphasizing about how like it's never too early to start. I think people oftentimes are like queer studies are too early to start for kids, or like kids don't want to learn about race, or it's too much for them to handle. And that's not true, because they notice differences at a young age and they internalize things. Like when I worked in an elementary school, like the language I'm about to use might be offensive to some people, but there were 5th graders calling each other wetbacks, but they were both Mexicans. So it's just like the way that kids internalize those things really young, hearing all that talk from the media and everything. And yeah, and we had to have some deep discussions, because I was like, you know, like I was like it doesn't make sense to yell at them and be like, don't do that, but I want to shake them and be like, love yourself and love others. But yeah. What about you, Anne or Vinson?
So I just love what everyone is saying about like identity and representation. And I think this is really common knowledge. I mean, there's the very well-known study, which I'm not going to be able to name like the name of it or the date, but of children, and Vinson, you kind of mentioned this imagery as well, but like children choosing dolls and young Black children saying that Black dolls were ugly, and representation, like we know means so much. And I would just share this like really insightful thing that I learned while I was doing some field work for my program. And I was working with a college advisor. It was at a high school. And so she helped a lot of students with their college applications. And she worked with a lot of the Latinx students in the school. And one thing she told me once was that like she saw her job is helping them tell their story in the most flattering light possible. And what she noticed was a lot of them had no, or she didn't see them or notice them having, oh, thank you, Leslye. I see that you put in the chat the Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark doll studies. Thank you. But the advisor told me that from what she saw, a lot of these students did not recognize the strength and resilience in their people. And she's like, these students are so strong. They're overcoming so much. There's so much strength in their history and heritage. And it's very beautiful. And I think that they are somewhat cut off from that. That is not the story that they are surrounded by. That's not a story that is told to them, at least by mainstream society. And so she just expressed, sadness at how these students like don't understand how incredible they are.
I love that, Anne. I think you're really like, that's why it's so empowering to take ethnic studies. When I was talking to my friend who's the high school teacher, she said that something that she really emphasized for the kids was that your history is important. Like the stuff that you know is important. Your family experience is history. You might not know about World War II, but you're able to talk about maybe how your family was brought over here and what circumstances they were brought over here under. And then it also gives them power to their experiences and to their lived experiences, that what you do on the weekend is important. The fact that you can speak a couple languages, it is important. It's contributing to the United States. So I think she says that a lot of high school students are really able to kind of gain a little bit more power and understand that they do hold power and that their experiences are valuable. And it's not just, and I think it is hard if you're going through a curriculum that doesn't reflect you at all. And something that she says was also just talking about culturally responsive teaching, which is something I hope all teachers can do, is just noticing the types of demographics or the needs that you have in your classroom and teaching so it's relevant for them. Any last thoughts, Vinson, about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that both you and Anne brought up, and everyone, that history and things in the classroom should be culturally relevant to what students are seeing. When they see like themselves represented in curriculum, they feel more connected to the things they're learning, and therefore they feel more empowered. And when you were talking about the doll studies, I remembered a quote from like a concept from bell hooks, the oppositional gaze, that I study from one of my classes, I think Chronicles of Education. And it was just really powerful to like learn like, oh, like from bell hooks perspective, like just like showing the gaze, that's how like folks from oppressed identities have to like they feel like there's this constant gaze that and sometimes we feel it too, like there's this gaze that just exists in society when we're just walking around every day. And it was just really interesting, because some of the children that y'all mentioned, like they feel that oppression and they feel the impacts of racism, so they're dealing with the gaze too. So it's like it's better to equip them with the words and concepts and knowledge to be able to discuss that, so they can grow and learn from each other.
Totally agree.
And the other thing is really thinking about this, if, at least from a teacher education perspective, if we assume that teachers go into the classroom with the skills that they've learned in the programs that they went through, then the programs have to be teaching this stuff. The programs have to reflect the type of pedagogy that is going to, serve the students that the teachers are going out into the classrooms to serve, right? And so graduate school programs, teacher credential training programs, et cetera, really have to do this work as well. We can't just continue with things as they are, and really need to make a purposeful, intentional effort towards that end.
Mm-hmm. And also, oh, sorry, Jackie, are you gonna say something?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to echo something, Leslye, that you said a little bit earlier too, which was if the intention was to involve students in learning and promote positive learning outcomes, then we should be doing the things that are shown to do that. And as you said, we can't just keep things the way they are. And when there is very clear evidence that for example, introducing ethnic studies and many other measures that can be taken can promote better learning outcomes for students. And when that does not happen, then it becomes obvious that the intentions are not actually just to give the best learning experience to students, but to, maintain the status quo and power systems that are currently in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it touched on the in the article, like they really liked the results they saw in that study that they did, and they expanded it to like all their other high schools. So definitely a step in the right direction. And
yeah,
I think that's something I always have to like remind myself, like baby steps, like it takes a collective effort to get this more commonly practiced, I would say.
Yeah, one day we will have ethnic studies for all, hopefully by 2023.
Yes.
So I guess one other thing that I wanted to touch on and get all of your thoughts on was ethnic studies is sometimes under attack. We saw in 2010, there was Tuscan Unified School District in Arizona that banned ethnic studies because they called it divisive, said that it was indoctrinating students. And you see that kind of talk now too and pushback against ethnic studies.
Mhm.
So I wanted to see how you all would respond to some of the claims that were actually made when they wanted to ban ethnic studies. And we even hear this now today from people like our president and people that are in very high positions of power. So one of them that I thought was interesting was that the courses teach students to be bitter and resent whites.
I'm sorry, that's a live reaction.
That was my reaction too. I was like, okay.
No, it teaches, well, I'll say this thing. When you're used to being centered in the curriculum, you also get to determine the tone of which you're discussed in the curriculum. And I think it's totally fine to talk about white people in the curriculum, but we also have to tell the truth. If you brutalized people, murdered people, raped people, denied people rights, wrote into laws things about people's skin color, and established all of these atrocities, I mean, you should want to take credit for that. And I understand why people don't want to take credit for that, because it sounds horrible. Dr. Joy DeGruy, she talks about this. She says that, it's a purposeful effort for us to keep the truth from white people, because if they really knew what their ancestors did, they would not be able to have a sanity about themselves on a daily basis. And I totally agree with that. I mean, it is critical that we learn from how horrible humans can be to other humans, and acknowledge that part of our ability to be horrible to other human beings is the fact that we did not believe them to be human. And that's one of the first pieces. We have to actually dehumanize folks in order to do the terrible things that we do. So I think that ethnic studies courses are not, for lack of a better word, white bashing courses in the same way that a course on gender is not male bashing, right? We just have to be able to allow our truth to exist, right? And certainly people don't have to agree with it, but I think it's critical that we speak truth to power.
It's a hard pill to swallow. Is that the phrase people use? But it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be, but it's still authentic. It's still, you can't change history. Like, this is what happened, and it's not talked about, or it's not really digested in like a healthy, like uplifting dialogue. And especially, me hearing about like generational trauma, just all these other things that come into this. And it's just like, okay, you're saying it's going to, people resent whites, and it's like, well, why don't you present it in a way where people, if that's your main concern, like, why don't you approach it in a way that doesn't get you that outcome? And it's just, how are you presenting this information, and like, who's involved in this conversation? That's where my mind goes to, because it's like, it's one thing being called bitter, but it's just like, well, people are still humans and we have emotions. So I don't know. It's just, I disagree with that statement for sure. But maybe that's kind of what Leslye was saying. Like, you're so used to being centered and just like this Eurocentric. And it's like, when you're starting to shift that away, that focus, there's going to be, again, people's emotions, but it's like, okay, like, maybe this isn't the space for your emotions to be processed through, but really just, what's the bigger picture? Like, why is this so important? And like, just this conversation we're having, like, it holds a lot of meaning for a lot of communities. So
no, I totally agree. I think it can bring uncomfortable feelings for everyone. Like, even if you're the group that's being discussed, or if you're the group you're part of the group that is the oppressor in that case, whether it's the white students or something like that. But I feel like in the end, it's so we can all be liberated and we can all be free. And I think those uncomfortable feelings do have to be processed. But I think if we don't know the truth, how can we move forward and how can we create a better society if we're continuing to operate under lies, which sounds very matrixy and like stuff like that, but it's true.
Yeah, I mean, the truth will set us free, right? That's what the quote is. So, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, my initial response to that is it just seems like a very classic, like derailing tactic of somebody who, you know, does not want to relinquish their power and privilege, you know, but also, like, I don't think it necessarily needs to teach people to hate white people, but I think it should teach people to hate white supremacy, which is what has allowed all these atrocities to take place and continue to take place up until this very day. And that absolutely should be hated and dismantled. And, you know, hopefully these courses would have a hand in showing students this and showing them the alternative to the whitewashed version of history that they were taught. And also there's another quote that you shared, Gabi. I don't know if you wanted to read it, but what I would really hope for, like, white students to feel by also like being required to take ethnic studies and to be exposed to our history is that it's true and it's real, but also that we can be something other than an oppressor, and we can be part of dismantling this horrific system.
I agree. So I can read the quote really quick. It was from an article in The Atlantic quoting a professor. I'll write it in the description box, but it goes, similar to students of color, white students have been miseducated about the roles of both white and people of color throughout history. Not only, and she says, culturally relevant lessons allow white children to not only learn about people of color, but also white people's roles as oppressors and activists fighting for racial change. This is very important because whites often feel that there's nothing they can do to change racism. And I think that's true, because I think just as it's empowering for students of color, it's also empowering for white students that they can be an ally, like a true ally in pushing forward change. So I love that. And I think some of the pushback ethnic studies gets misses the point about ethnic studies and how it helps all of us. So we're almost at time, but thank you all for engaging in this discussion. And I would love to continue this discussion more with you all later. For our little closing, I would just like to hear about one reading, one book, one movie that changed your perspective, or a podcast that you listened to.
This is so hard. No.
I'll go first. My favorite podcast is Code Switch. It always teaches me an alternate view of the things that I learned and about a different race-based lens to look at the way the world is working at now. And it can be a song or anything quick.
I'll choose to share this because it just arrived today. Black Women's Liberatory Pedagogies. It's a anthology that is co-edited by Olivia Perlow, Doreen Wheeler, Sharon Bethia, and Barbara M. Scott. And the subtitle is Resistance, Transformation, and Healing Within and Beyond the Academy. So I look forward to reading this. So I just want to honor those women today.
Thank you, Leslye.
I can go. So one thing, if people are interested in kind of like also the perspective of how it is just, well, I don't know, it is also beneficial to like everybody, white people included. A podcast episode that I really liked was an episode of the podcast Verses, which is hosted by spoken word poets, Franny Choi and Dinesh Smith, and a guest that they had. It was issued on August 4th with the guest Michael Lee. And he's also a spoken word poet, and he is a spoken word poet, but he's become very vocal in racial activism recently, and so he shares his perspectives as a white ally on that topic.
Awesome. I'll have to check that out.
For me, the only thing that comes to my mind right now is I have like a playlist of some of Angela Davis's speeches, and they're just so empowering. It's just like, I don't know. I don't know what the playlist is called. It's on Spotify. I think like
It's on Spotify.
You've seen it?
I've seen it, but I haven't listened to it either. So we should start like a little podcast club.
Yes, it's so good. What about you, Vinson?
For me, I just remember this podcast that I listened to in one of my classes, The Miseducation of Larry P. And that one was just really powerful, just talking about IQ tests and how they discriminate against students of color and from minority groups. So that was really, gave me a different perspective on things. And there are a lot of books on different, the miseducation of, and then there's so many different, categories of different identities on miseducation of. So definitely something interesting to look out for.
That's so funny. I thought you were going to say the miseducation of Warren Hill for something.
No, the Larry P case is what's the word? So, such a historical landmark moment, right, in education to really address some of the cultural unfairness in assessment. So thank you for mentioning that, Vinson.
I'm going to have to check out everyone's recommendations. So thank you all for tuning in for today's podcast episode. And one thing I ask of you is to think about and reflect on a time in your K through 12 experience where you learned a view of history that you later learned to either be untrue or to not be the full picture. You can either write it in a journal, or I encourage you to also talk about it with friends, parents, people in your circle, and to take the next week easy. And again, thank you for joining in, and see you next time. Leslye.
There is one other book that I just realized is on my shelf. It's called Rethinking Ethnic Studies, and it's written by the Rethinking Schools Project. So I'll make sure that we put this in the link below our YouTube video so that people can also access that book.
Great, awesome.